Republican senators to set the agenda next year.
Its report after about a year of study over the defense needs of the United States and our future requirements for a defense strategy and funding of that strategy. I had the honor of serving on that commission during the time that preceded my current presence in the United States Senate. The commission was appointed by the members, the chairman and the ranking members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee. There were 6 appointed from each of the 2 bodies, so a total of 12, and it was a division equally between Republicans and Democrats. I was privileged to have been appointed by my predecessor, Senator John McCain. The commission is chaired by Ambassador Eric Edelman and retired Admiral Gary Roughead. And it included defense experts who had served in Congress, who had served in the intelligence community, the diplomatic community, the military, and there was 1 former political person, myself. As I said, we were tasked with the job of studying our national defense strategy and advised to provide recommendations to the Secretary of Defense and to the Congress about our future courses of action. The Commission worked very hard to review all of the pertinent information related to the formation of the Trump administration National Defense Strategy, which had been issued earlier in the year. And this effort included examining the assumptions, the missions, the force posture and structure, as well as strategic and military risks associated with the execution of that national defense strategy. The Commission particularly focused on the threats to the United States and the size and shape of the force required to deter and, if necessary, defeat these threats. It focused on the readiness of our force, the posture and capabilities of the force, and the allocation of resources, and also examined the strategic and military risks that informed the development of both the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy. This commission, Madam President, has demonstrated that even in Washington, D.C., it is possible to get a genuinely bipartisan consensus on something. In this case, our consensus on United States national security. We agreed that, for example, budget-driven strategies that assume too much risk will cost us more in the long run than properly funded strategies based on a realistic assessment of the current strategic environment. That's kind of a long way of saying that what this bipartisan commission concluded on a consensus basis, no dissenting views at all, was that we risked more by proceeding with the rebuilding of our military constrained by budget requirements than if we were to increase the budget for defense spending and eliminate the impediments to sensible acquisition, such as the continuing resolution and the sequestration requirements that Congress has been engaged in over the past several years. What this commission said in stark headlines is the United States faces a national emergency. It concluded in very stark terms that we might lose a war with China or Russia, and that the only way to avoid this is to adequately fund the strategy that the Secretary of Defense has set out. His prioritization, the commission concluded, is exactly right. We have to change from focusing solely or primarily on fighting a war in the Middle East or conflicts with terrorists, and instead change to focusing on the threats that are posed by potential adversaries, Russia and China. If we have the capability of dealing with those threats by deterring them, or if necessary, defeating them, then we should also be able to have the ability to deal with terrorism, to deal with North Korea, and deal with Iran. But that our first priority needs to be to focus on China and on Russia. The NDS Commission report argues, and I'm quoting now, the U.S. military could suffer unacceptably high casualties and loss of major capital assets in its next conflict. It might struggle to win, or perhaps lose, a war against China or Russia. The United States is particularly at risk of being overwhelmed should its military forces be required to fight on 2 or more fronts simultaneously. End of quote. Now, some might oppose such strong wording, but the Commission believed that we have to be able to talk honestly about the state of our military preparedness and our national security. As Ambassador Edelman, chairman of the Commission, stated, and I'm quoting again, "It is probably more dangerous to tell ourselves and other people that we're going to be able to do these things when in fact we aren't able to do them because we're not paying for them." End of quote. The object of a strong military is to deter conflict from ever occurring. And you do that by demonstrating that you're able to prevail in a conflict if necessary. So you have to have the capability of defeating any adversary you might face. If you have that capability, those adversaries are less likely to miscalculate, to assume that they might be able to advance their parochial interests without a pushback from the United States, NATO, or our other allies. And they come to this belief if they examine their capabilities against ours and determine that we are lacking in the ability to stop them. What this report says is we've got to get serious about rebuilding our military, or we run the risk of bad actors in the world deciding that they can take a chance that we won't respond. So let me summarize what this report says. And again, I can't emphasize too much. I know it's Washington, D.C. I know we're talking about difficult issues here. But these 12 Democrats and Republicans, equally divided, reached a conclusion, a consensus about what we need to do, and we're willing to speak very strongly about it. So it's possible for Democrats and Republicans to get together on something in this city, and I'm hoping that my colleagues in the House and in the Senate will approach the issues in the same bipartisan spirit that characterized the deliberations of the Commission. Here's the summary. First, we're in a state of national emergency. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, the United States is at risk of losing a war against these peer competitors. That's a euphemism for China and Russia. Second, there's a bipartisan consensus that Congress must provide predictable and sufficient funding for the Department of Defense to execute the strategy that it's developed, the National Defense Strategy. And this means that Congress must undo sequestration, which is the provision in law that says that if we don't meet certain budget requirements, that all departments of the government, including the Department of Defense, have to cut right off at the top an equal percentage of funding in order to get back to those budget levels. For the Defense Department, it's impossible to both provide for our national security and comply with that requirement. So sequestration has to end. Secondly, we have to return to the regular order of appropriating funding for the Department of Defense on an annual basis at the beginning of each fiscal year so that the Pentagon can do the planning necessary and the people who provide the weaponry and other products to the Defense Department can plan adequately for the development and production of these items on a sensible basis, on a basis that enables them to calculate in the future how much money they'll have over the period of time that they need. We can't do that if instead we continue to operate on what's called continuing resolutions, where Congress throws up its hand sometime in the late summer and says, we're never going to agree on how much to fund the various departments of government, including the Department of Defense. Let's just agree to continue to do the same amount of spending we did last year on the same things. Well, think about that in your family budget. If instead of each year you try to figure out what we're going to need this year, and it's going to be a little different than last year. We just say, we'll just keep spending the same amount that we spent last year on the same things. It's a very illogical way, and it's a very detrimental way for us to provide for our national defense. And the third thing that the Commission recommended is that we have to increase the top line, or the total amount of money spent on defense or over the next many years if we're going to truly rebuild our military. Last year, a deal was struck in which we agreed to a 2-year funding for the Department of Defense that staunched the flow of blood from the inadequate funding of years previous. But all it did was to temporarily provide funds primarily to increase our readiness. It did not provide enough to rebuild our military. It provided enough to start the journey, which may take us 15 or 20 years. But that's how long, with increased funding, it'll take to do the job. And we concluded that we ignore the issues at our peril, that today our adversaries undermine U.S. goals on a daily basis, and that continued neglect of our defense capabilities put our nation at risk. Well, what are the specific conclusions here? This report, and I'm quoting now, that America's military superiority, these are quotations, has eroded to a dangerous degree, that the United States is in a crisis of national security. Quote, the United States is particularly at risk of being overwhelmed should its military be forced to fight on 2 or more fronts simultaneously, end of quote. In other words, we found a national emergency, that this country is at risk of actually being defeated by Russia or China should we find ourselves in conflict with them. Now, nobody is predicting a war today or even tomorrow, but we've seen the nationalistic designs that China has in its region of the world, and we've seen repeated efforts by Vladimir Putin's Russia to advance its sphere of influence, particularly in Eastern Europe. The taking of the Crimea, the invasion of Ukraine, shooting down of a civilian airliner, use of chemical agents prohibited by treaties, by the way, on foreign soil to deal with people with whom it disagrees. Somebody has likened Vladimir Putin to the burglar in the hotel that walks down the hallway, pushing on each door until he finds one that's not locked, that he can go in and burglarize. He is an opportunist who takes advantage of weakness. And the last thing we want to do is to suggest to him that we would not or could not respond to actions that he takes. In other words, to prevent him from miscalculating, you've got to deter conduct that could lead to conflict. And the way that the Russian military doctrine works these days is it starts with a hybrid war. It's not a fighting war to begin with. It's done through cyber attacks, through propaganda, through actions that perhaps utilize contractors rather than Russian military to go into another country so that they have plausible deniability until they have achieved their initial goals, and then have the Russian military move into the area and even potentially, according to Russian doctrine, use nuclear weapons. They would do this on a tactical basis to do what they call escalate to de-escalate. In other words, to suggest to NATO, the United States, and other allies that for us to respond to that attack could lead to a nuclear conflagration. The Russians have the tactical weapons. They have 10 times more than we do. So they can use them on a battlefield and then say, look, we've taken the territory we want to take. We're done for now. And you just need to leave us alone rather than getting involved in this conflict. That's the kind of way that we could be drawn into a conflict, even though there's not a big army attack or air attack to begin such a conflict. It's the escalation ladder where tactical nuclear weapons might be used, and then it's up to the United States to decide what to do next. This is the kind of thing in which miscalculation can occur. And the United States has got to persuade countries like Russia and China that they shouldn't begin the process of calculating whether they could defeat us with the assumption that we wouldn't or couldn't respond. That's what deterrence is all about. Nobody wants war, but you prevent war by demonstrating to the aggressor that it's not worth it for that aggressor to start the conflict. He's going to lose more than he can potentially gain. We don't get to define whether we have adequate deterrence. That's defined by our potential adversary. What do they think we can do? And in the last many years, both the Chinese and Russians have gone to war, have gone to school on the United States in the way that we conduct our military activities. For example, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan. They understand our strengths and weaknesses. And they've been spending a lot of money on research and development and readiness and weapon acquisition and doctrine to take advantage of our weaknesses in an asymmetrical way in order to defeat us if there should ever be a conflict between us. The Chinese have put a lot, for example, into their space-based capabilities, trying to knock the United States out of space so that our satellites can't tell our weapons where to fire or tell our troops how to get where they need to go. The Russians are very good in cyber activity. They would like to be able to deny us the ability to communicate with each other and to do the other things that we rely upon through cyberspace. They've developed very capable modern technology and weaponry that in some cases is much better than ours. They have the ability to deny us access to battlefields through their long-range air defenses, for example. So the United States no longer has superiority in all military fields. We can expect not to have air superiority, for example, in a conflict with Russia. These are problems that have to be remedied, and they can't be remedied overnight. And what our commission concluded was we have to recognize the potential threat. The reason our adversaries have developed the kinds of weapons and doctrine they have is because they want to be prepared in the event of conflict between us. We're not going to start a conflict, but we want to make sure that they don't miscalculate to start one. And that starts with having a military which they understand is sufficient to defeat them. That's what real deterrence is all about. This report should not be understood as a criticism of the Secretary of Defense or of the Defense Department. It is true that we say that there are areas that need improvement, but Secretary Mattis knows as well as anyone what the nature of this threat is. He is able to say, I will make do with what the Congress gives us, but I don't think he's able to say, and I know in my heart that that'll be sufficient. In fact, earlier this year, he warned us, and I'm quoting, that our competitive edge has eroded in every domain of warfare: air, land, sea, space, and cyber. The combination of rapidly changing technology, the negative impact on military readiness resulting from the longest continuous period of combat in our nation's history, and a prolonged period of unpredictable and insufficient funding created an overstretched and under-resourced military. End of quotation. So, Madam President, he's recognized the problem. And I think it's up to the Congress to respond to his recognition of the problem and to the report of this bipartisan commission. We've all heard plenty about the results of this underfunding. We've seen aircraft that aren't able to fly or that crash. We've seen Navy ships that collide with each other and other kinds of catastrophes that have befallen our military. Today, our military is the smallest that it's been since 1940, since before World War II. We face munition shortages. We obviously need to refresh our worn-out troops and the equipment. There are urgent requirements to modernize our nuclear deterrent. The deterrent that says to the Russians or the Chinese, for example, and in the future, North Korea and perhaps Iran, don't even think about a nuclear conflict with us. We have the ability to destroy you. We're in the process of modernizing that, and it's going to take a long time and a lot of money to do that. Defense spending is near historic lows. We think because last year we made a deal to slightly increase it for a 2-year period of time that we've solved the problem. That's not true. As a share of both the federal budget and the national economy, we're spending at near historic lows on defense. And we now have enough evidence to know that mindless spending cuts, as would be required by sequestration, for example, don't make the Department of Defense more efficient. There are always savings to be had in the Department of Defense, but that's not the way to achieve them. In fact, reforming the larger drivers of the Pentagon's budget would actually require legislative changes that the Congress has been unwilling to make. So let's put the burden where it lies, and that is on the Congress to fix a lot of these problems. Between the fiscal years 2012 and 2019, the Department of Defense will have sustained $539 billion in cuts over the budget plan proposed by Secretary of Gates in the year 2010. So Secretary of Gates said, here's our 20-year plan. And we're almost halfway through that plan, and we've already suffered almost $500 billion in cuts over what he said we would need. If defense spending continues at the planned rate through 2021, it'll take another 19 years to reverse all of the Budget Act's cuts that occurred as a result of sequestration. Obviously, we've got work to do. I've talked about the threat. Let me just mention a couple other points that we made in the report. And we commented on the Defense Department's National Security Report, the National Defense Strategy, which was published in 2017, actually helped to make this case for us. It argued that we face, and again I'm quoting, an extraordinarily dangerous world, that threats have intensified in recent years. We face a world where, and again quoting, China and Russia challenge American power, where, quote, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Islamic Republic of Iran are determined to destabilize regions, quote, where transnational threat groups are actively trying to harm Americans. So when I speak of China and Russia, I don't mean to demean the threats posed by other actors like North Korea and Iran or the terrorists who continue to threaten us. I'm simply noting the most serious threat should conflict arise. And this focus on China and Russia, I think, is prudent because both countries, as I said, have extensively modernized their forces, including their nuclear weapons arsenals. And they've routinely taken actions that threaten and coerce and intimidate others in the region. For the last 17 years, most of our forces have been organized and manned and trained and equipped to fight smaller scale wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think in the meantime, some of our planners have forgotten how to plan and operationalize large-scale military conflicts. This we have to relearn while we still have time. Our adversaries are not waiting, as I said. They don't face similar fiscal constraints as we do. And I was asked the other evening, well, isn't it true that we spend a lot more in our military than Russia and China do? And the answer is, this isn't even an apples and oranges comparison. We're honest about our budgeting. We're transparent. We even put out in the public what our intelligence community top-line budget is. The Russians and Chinese don't do that. They hide as much as they can. They don't pay their forces the way we do. 70% of our defense budget is for our forces, our manpower, in the pay and in the benefits and in the health care that they need. And we don't have the combined industrial base that with the military that the Chinese do, for example, and that the Russians do, so that what we spend is all out there. They can hide a lot of their spending in the activities of their industrial companies that are doing the work of the Chinese army, for example. So that's not a valid comparison. I think, Madam President, I'll just conclude this way. I was in the Congress for 26 years. I served on the House Armed Services Committee. I came to the Senate and served on numerous commissions and task forces, that the Intelligence Committee, for example, for 8 years, that looked into the threats that we face and what we need to do about those threats. I led efforts dealing with our strategic deterrent, our nuclear modernization effort. And I was sobered by the evidence that we received as a member of the Defense Strategy Committee. Taken aback. I had not been in the Senate for 5 years. I hadn't had the advantage of briefings, classified briefings on the status of our adversaries' efforts and our own. And I was shocked at the degree to which we have lost the advantage that we used to have. And I shared the concerns of my colleagues that this could lead potential adversaries to miscalculate, to think that they could make moves and wouldn't be resisted by the United States because we don't have the capability anymore to do that. That has to change if we're to avoid war. And therefore, I urge my colleagues in the days and weeks to come to review this commission report, to think about it in terms of a consensus document between Republicans and Democrats who unanimously agreed that it was critical to tell the American people the truth, that we have a severe crisis in this country, and to recognize that we, the Congress, the House and the Senate, have the first obligation to do something about this by setting the policy through our National Defense Authorization Acts and then funding those policies adequately through a series of eliminating sequestration, funding through the regular order appropriation process rather than continuing resolutions, and increasing the top-line budget for the military enough to make up the gap that we discuss in this report here. That effort will begin in the administration with the development of its budget, which is underway right now and will be submitted to the Congress in the early spring. And I urge the administration as well to recognize that its leadership in this effort will have a lot to do with the success of Congress stepping up to do its job to fund that budget adequately. So to my colleagues who are concerned about our national security and who isn't, and to those who said during the last campaign, we want to work across the aisle to solve problems that confront the American people, well, I can't think of a more serious problem than this. This is a great opportunity to roll up our sleeves and work together. And I pledge to work with my colleagues to do exactly that, and commend to them this report of the National Defense Strategy Commission, to review it over the Thanksgiving break that we're going to have here and come back ready to do work. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.